What's going on, guys? It's me, Zach, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. In this one, I'm going to go over three auction draft strategies that I found to be pretty effective in drafts this season. I'll sort of go into the approach you take with each one of them, and then explain to you the pros and cons of each of them, and then I'll give you, in general, which one I tend to find myself following. Obviously, with any strategy, you want to make sure that you go into your draft being willing to pivot, because if value presents itself from one strategy rather than another, you don't want to be closed off from that. But I think that it's also helpful to go into your draft knowing sort of which sort of different builds you can make for your roster, knowing that um, if you do pivot from one strategy to the other, you have some sort of template to follow, so you don't feel lost while you're drafting. Um, with that said, if this is your first time at this channel, thank you guys for watching. I'd certainly appreciate a like and a subscription if you do find anything value out of this video. Click the bell. We do 3 videos a week, so there'll be plenty of content there. Um, yeah, still at 78 subs right now, hoping to get to 100 by the start of the football season, so let's see if we can get there. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll get going with the first strategy. So the first strategy I want to go over is the aggressive strategy. The gist of the strategy is that you're going to take 2 or 3 top tier players. Almost think of this like having 2 first-round picks in a snake draft. But then you have to understand that when you do that, you are sacrificing several later picks. So maybe many of you have played in leagues with draft pick trading, and maybe you've traded a couple of your middle round picks to get a second first-round pick. That's basically essentially what you're doing here. You're then going to have to use the remaining of your budget to fill any gaps you have in your roster, and there will likely be a lot of them. One of the cons of this strategy is that it does make it difficult to find value later in drafts. Say a middle tier guy is going for far under his value, and he would be someone you're interested in, but you've already spent 90% of your money on 2 or 3 players to start the draft. It makes it really hard for you to be involved in a lot of the bidding. So if you do take the strategy, you have to understand that after you get those 2 or 3 players, you're probably going to be sitting on the sidelines for a while during the draft. And it's also going to be very likely that somebody almost always will have more money than you and will be able to outbid you. So you do lose your pick in terms of being able to choose and pick and choose which players you want after that. And that makes it pretty likely that you start slow to the season. You're going to have to probably work the waiver wire to fill any of those holes, but it does give you a lot of upside because you have those 2 or 3 top tier players. So here's an example of some sort of team you could build. All of these auction values are pulled just from a standard 12-team PPR on ESPN. And as you can see, the 2 players that I targeted as your top tier players are Jonathan Taylor and Austin Ekeler. Note that those 2 are some of the more expensive options, and maybe you could find cheaper options, but you can then see that I was able to get 3 decent receivers in Sutton, A-Rob, and St. Brown, and then after that, you have to go cheap everywhere else. And as you can see here, I got a lot of guys that I personally am high on and think have a lot of upside, but there's no guarantee that you get a lot of those later guys for those $2 values, because anybody that has that extra cash laying around is going to outbid you. So just keep that in mind. This is a really idealistic scenario, but there will certainly be instances in which the players you want on this list end up going more expensive. And I'm not by any means saying that you want to follow this template exactly. This is just how I would have approached the aggressive strategy, assuming all the auction values held true. Yeah, but with that, I'll move on to the next strategy. The next strategy I want to go over here is the patient strategy. Think of this one as sort of the opposite of the aggressive strategy we just touched on. It's essentially the equivalent of trading your first round pick in a snake draft for extra middle round picks. And it does result in an extremely deep roster, but without many projected superstars. So that does sort of cap your upside. I think that makes it makes your team a lot safer, and I think it's a pretty safe bet if you're just trying to make the playoffs. But I think that you'll often find that if you take this build, you're going to have a hard time really winning the whole thing without being able to make some trades during the season. And it is pretty risky, even though it may seem safe, because say you and 2 other players take this approach, then both of you, or all 3 of you, have all of your auction money going into what would normally be the third or fourth round. And that means that all of those players that are left are going to get bid up because all three of you need them very badly, and you're going to find yourself in bidding wars and overpaying for players. Um, but if things do work out and you happen to be the only team doing this, it can work out quite well. Right here, I created a example of how I would sort of approach the patient strategy this year. Still think you want to take a look at trying to get both running backs or get two good running backs. So I chose Chubb and Elliott just because I think those are some of the better values right now. And then I was able to get a lot of receivers I really like in Pittman, Williams, St. Brown, Sutton, Mooney. And on top of that, I was able to get Kelsey, which personally, as you can see, I really like this team. I do prefer this roster to the one that was created using the aggressive strategy, but there's a lot more risk inherent in doing this strategy because you might not get these guys for as expensive as they're supposed to go for. I will note that Kelsey and Mark Andrews, for that matter, do seem to be screaming values during auction drafts on the ESPN format because they, for whatever reason, are going in the low 30s, and at the same time, they're projected to be late first or early second to late second round draft picks, and those should in general have a value of about $50. And so I think that you'll see in a lot of your drafts that these tight ends go for a lot more expensive than they're supposed to be. But in your home leagues, that pre-draft value that shows up does hold a lot of weight with people you're drafting with, so you can definitely target the tight ends there. And yeah, so it's basically same thing here. Obviously, this example is not any sort of template for you guys to follow, but it's just sort of something for you guys to look at and see if you sort of like the structure of that roster. As you can see, this team could sustain a few injuries at different positions, and it would still be competitive. I will say that between the patient and aggressive strategies, the patient strategy maybe makes a little bit more sense in larger leagues. In the aggressive strategy, say you're in an 8 or 10 team league, there's going to be a lot more opportunity to find good players on waivers. So that top tier talent is going to make a lot more of a difference. As to where in a deeper league, you're going to have a harder time finding contributors to your roster during the season. So it might make more sense to get yourself some more depth early on. Strategy I want to go over here is the balance strategy. It's sort of a hybrid between the aggressive and the patient strategy. The idea of it is that you take one elite player, and then you use the money that you save by not getting that second one to create a more complete starting roster and maybe have a little bit more depth than you would if you were to take the aggressive strategy. This does guarantee you some top level talent, which is really important if you want to win your league. It's important to have at least one or maybe two players that can win you your week on their own. But it reduces the risk of you getting yourself caught in bidding wars later and feeling like you desperately need to add players. I've been in plenty of drafts where I've taken that patient strategy, and then it gets to the 40th player nominated, and you still don't have a player on your roster. So then you start getting a little desperate, and you feel like you need to make sure you get players, and then you overpay for everybody, and it gets really difficult to create a quality roster when you're doing that. So this sort of reduces that risk, and it still leaves you enough money to take value if it presents itself. Contrary to the aggressive strategy, as to where if you spend all of your money early on, even if there's a great value opportunity that presents itself during the draft, it's going to be hard for you to get involved because you don't have the money to do that. With this strategy, you would. So here's an example roster I've put together. Basically, it took Jonathan Taylor here. So it's the equivalent of having the first round pick in your draft, or the first overall pick, and then was able to still get a decent RB2 in Nick Chubb, who I'm actually pretty high on this season. Was able to get some better receivers than I got during the aggressive strategy because I didn't have to get Allen Robinson as a starter, and was able to upgrade to Mike Williams there. And I was still able to get Travis Kelce rather than Zach Ertz when compared to the aggressive strategy. So I think that, again, this is not any sort of template for you to follow during your draft this season, but I think it's a nice example of what you could create by taking this approach. As you can see, even though you only got one top tier running back, I still think there's plenty of talent on this roster to compete, and there's also enough depth that if there were to be an injury for a few weeks to one of your players, you could survive it for a few weeks. So I think the balance strategy is sort of the nice in between when compared to the patient and aggressive strategy, and it gives you sort of a bit of the best of both worlds. So in most of my drafts, I do tend to lean towards this balanced strategy, but I think that, sort of like I've touched on earlier, your league size will also mandate the approach you should take. In larger drafts, I think it's more important to get depth and understand that you're not going to be able to find replacements for players during the course of the season, as to where if you're in a smaller league, 8-10 teams, then go get that top tier talent and get those elite stars, because you're going to have a hard time finding stars, because there's obviously not very many of them. But I don't think it'll be too hard for you to find quality waiver wire replacements throughout the season if there were to be anything wrong with the rest of your players. And giving yourself that upside definitely gives you a chance at winning your league. And yeah, so I guess in general, I tend to lean towards a balanced strategy to start my drafts, and then I look for value elsewhere. If a second elite running back after I get that first one starts going cheap, I'll certainly be interested in it. You obviously don't want to go into any draft with any sort of fixed strategy, but having a sort of template that you want to follow is nice, and then just having a bunch of different pivot options for when value presents itself is really important. So yeah, thank you guys. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.